I appreciate you guys being here this morning. First off, I just want to say that. And I'm excited to be here. When I saw that Norman was thinking about putting together a Christian Libertarian Liberty Conference, I said, I really want to speak at this. This is something that's really exciting for me, and I'm really glad that I could be here with you guys today. I have to tell you, though, that my mother would probably not be pleased. She was one of these people that had that very, I guess maybe old-fashioned notion that you don't talk about religion or politics in polite society. I take a little bit of solace in the fact that probably a group of libertarians wouldn't be considered polite society, so I might be off the hook there on that. But I am really excited to be here because this conference brings together two of the most significant things in my life. First off, my faith in Jesus Christ. And then secondly, my conviction and passion that we were created to live free. Now, my job, my hat that I wear most of the time is that of a political activist. So you're not going to get any deep theology today or any great deep philosophy. You're really just going to get some thoughts from a political activist on why it is important for us as Christians and as people who love liberty to be engaged in the process. Most of the time when I speak, I talk about this principle called nullification, and I'm going to give you the short version. Nullification is essentially a constitutional principle that was developed by James Madison and Thomas Jefferson in response to the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798. And basically what it is it's the idea that states have not only the right, but the responsibility, the duty to step in, take action to stop unconstitutional overreaching acts by the federal government. I kind of talk about it in terms of almost an institutionalized, legitimized action of civil disobedience. It's the state basically saying, no, you're not allowed to do this, and we're going to take action to stop you. So that's my thing that I normally talk about, but I'm not going to talk very much about that today. If you're interested in the subject and you're wondering, what is this dude talking about, I do have some books out on the table that I would love to sell you. Good capitalism there. But as I said, I'm a political activist, and for a while, I'm going to be honest with you, this created a little bit of conflict in my life because I spent about 10 years as in music ministry, and I kind of grew up with that dynamic that you have secular stuff and you have religious stuff. And I did religious stuff, and that made me really good religious person, and people that were doing secular stuff, you know, good job, but, you know, if you were doing religious stuff, it would be much more religious. So I had a little bit of a conflict when I really started getting involved in politics because that's very much secular. And I think this stems from the fact that we have a tendency to compartmentalize our lives. You know, it's almost like kids with their plate of dinner, you know, and they get mad when the peas touch the potatoes. I think a lot of our lives are like that. A lot of Americans, you know, you've got your religion space over here, and you've got your work over here, and you've got your family stuff over here, and these things don't ever mix. And I have to confess, I had a bit of that mentality moving along. And so for most of my life, my political ideology and my faith were almost two divergent streams. And honestly, oftentimes ran counter to each other. I came from basically, I guess you would call it a neocon background, or maybe religious right, staunch Republican, you know, love Rush Limbaugh. I am a little bit ashamed to admit this, but I've not only voted for one Bush. Not only did I vote for 2 Bushes, I voted for 3 Bushes. Yeah, I'm sorry. I won't do it again, I promise. I lived in Florida when Jeb was governor, so that's the point of view that I came from. In fact, I was talking to Norman, and Norman and I first met about 4.5 years ago when we did one of our Nullify Now events here in Austin. And we got here the day before, and we went out and joined a group of folks that was doing some sign waving and sign holding anti-war stuff here in Austin. And I got to admit, it kind of creeped me out a little bit. I'm like, what are these people doing? You know, I don't know if I want to be seen with these hippies. And you know, now I would gladly be standing right out there with them. So my faith and my political ideas didn't ever really intersect until the last 3 or 4 years. But I've come to believe that this is increasingly important and that we shouldn't make this distinction between our faith and our political ideologies. In fact, when you look at the Scripture, you see that God is very holistic in terms of what he wants from us and from our lives. He doesn't just want religious devotion. He wants to be Lord of our lives. And I look at the verses in the 3rd chapter of Colossians where Paul talks about whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as if working for the Lord. So there really isn't this dichotomy between secular and religious. There shouldn't be the separation of things. These things should mesh together. And I think that our work that we do that's quote-unquote secular is just as important to the kingdom of God as people who are serving in ministry and doing those other types of important things. I think it's interesting, and Doug touched on this, and I kind of want to use this as an example, that within the liberty movement, I think we as Christians can bring a baseline of moral authority to the movement, because we do have the scriptures, we do have the traditions of the church that have all long been very important in social movements for justice and right things. You know, the anti-war movement has often been driven by Christian thinking. And specifically, the abolitionist movement in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s was very much driven by Christian thought. They gave the moral underpinning to the drive to free slaves. And I'm going to kind of touch on that today, because what I really want to do is I'm going to tell you a story. And this is one of my favorite little pieces of history that long ago fell down the Orwellian memory hole. And I have to thank Tom Woods for kind of digging this little piece of history out. It's about a man, and this man's name is Joshua. And at this point in the story, we don't even really know what Joshua's last name was. In fact, he probably didn't have a last name, because to give a slave a last name humanized them. And the institution of slavery would have never survived had the black people that were in bondage been able to humanize themselves. They were looked at as inferior, as even animals. And not giving them last names was part of this dehumanizing process. So at this point, we only know this man as Joshua. We know very, very little about his early life, the first 33 years of his life. We don't know where he was born. We don't know who his parents were. We don't know if he had any siblings. But we do know specifically where he was on the morning of January 1st, 1850. He was standing in front of the courthouse in St. Louis, Missouri, probably stripped naked in the cold, preparing to be sold. We know that that day he was bought by a man named Benamy Stone Garland, who was a very prominent farmer and landowner near St. Louis, close to the Mississippi River. He was sold that day. We don't really know how much he was purchased for, but we do know that he was brought with a couple of other slaves to this farm, and he spent the next 2 or 3 years laboring as a slave. Now, at some point during his bondage, and we have no idea why, he began to entertain thoughts of freedom. Now, for us here today in the United States, it's easy for us to say, well, gosh, who wouldn't entertain thoughts of freedom? Who wouldn't act? You know, we like to be all tough. I would have run away instantly. But to think about the situation that these folks were in, this was the life that they knew. And there's you hear the saying, sometimes the evil that we know is better than the one we don't know. I think this was very true of many people that were held in slavery. They didn't know what freedom would bring, but they did know, being a slave, as horrible as it was, they got fed, they had a roof over their heads, they had some form of community. So it really took quite a bit of courage to take that step and say, I'm going to run away, especially considering the fact that running away from slavery could very easily end, if not in death, at least horrible punishment, possibly being sold south into worse conditions that they were in now. But for whatever reason, Joshua felt that tug of freedom stronger than he felt the security of his slavery. And in 1852, at the age of 38, he made that decision. We know from some testimony that he later gave that there was a barge that was in the Mississippi River. It was used as a schoolhouse for black children. And oftentimes, late at night, it would be brought over to the Missouri side of the river. People would get on it, and the boat would be moved over to the Illinois side of the river, and the people would get off. And this is exactly what Joshua did late that night. And for the first time in his life, he set foot on free soil as a free man. I kind of like to think about what must have gone through his mind as he stepped off of that boat. We know that he was somewhat of a religious man. I like to think that he probably got down on his knees and thanked his God that he was free. But this was only the very, very beginning of what would be a very long journey. He actually walked 350 miles to a little town in Wisconsin called Racine. We don't know why he picked Racine particularly. Maybe 350 miles was enough walking. There was a black community there, so it was possible that he found some fellowship. We don't really know, but he ended up settling in Racine. He got a job as a worker at a sawmill, and for the first time in his life, he got a paycheck. Well, he didn't get a paycheck because he didn't write checks. He got pay cash, and he had his own place that he could live. It was just a single room with a dirt floor, but it was his. He could lock that door, lock out the world, and have privacy for the first time in his life. But there was always a specter hanging over an escaped slave, especially during the 1850s, between that 1850 and 1860 time period, because the federal government had passed a law called the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. If you ever want to read one of the most horrible, draconian laws ever passed by the U.S. Congress, Google the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Essentially what it did was it allowed a white person to go into any northern state, find any black person, and say, that's my property. And based on the word of that white man, that person was his property. And he could get a writ, have him arrested, and drag him back south into slavery. The idea was that he was supposed to be able to reclaim his fugitive slave. It was a property issue. It was also used as a front for kidnapping. Many, many free blacks were grabbed and sent south because they were worth a lot of money down there. It also forbid the person that was accused of being a runaway slave from having any say in the hearing. In other words, if you're accused of being a fugitive slave, it's the word of the white dude, you cannot produce any evidence, you cannot testify on your own behalf, you cannot have anybody testify for you. It was the word of the white guy. You're hosed. So Joshua lived under this specter. He lived under fear, and sure enough, it came to pass that Benjamin Stone Garland came looking for him. And one night he was playing cards with another man, and there was a bang on the door. And these guys rushed in, and they clocked him over the head, and they threw him in a wagon, and they drug him off to St. Louis so they could have a hearing the next day and take Joshua back into slavery. But fortunately for Joshua, the newspaper editor in the town of Racine heard about it, called a newspaper editor in Milwaukee named Sherman Booth and said, hey, we just had one of our citizens kidnapped, and we hear he's been hauled down to the jail there in Milwaukee. Well, Sherman Booth was a staunch abolitionist, so he took action. And when he found out that this was true, he gathered people together. He actually ran through the town of Milwaukee saying, we have slave catchers in our midst. If you care about freedom, come to the courthouse at 2 o'clock this afternoon. That was a paraphrase. That's not exactly what he said, but it's close. Amazingly, that afternoon, between 2,000 and 3,000 people had gathered in front of the courthouse in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Think about that a minute. The AP story today would read, 200 or so people gathered in front of the courthouse. That's how the AP rolls. 2,000, that was a lot of people in Milwaukee. And it's pretty amazing because it wasn't a riot. It was actually something of a political gathering. They actually drafted resolutions. They divided into wards. They had votes. They demanded that Joshua would be given a writ of habeas corpus. The judge rejected it. The crowd got angrier. And by the end of the day, Sherman Booth stood up and said, you know, sometimes you have to take matters into your own hands. I'm not saying that this is the time, but sometimes you do. And finally, the crowd got to the point, realizing that Joshua was going to be drugged back south if they didn't take action. A man named John Raycraft grabbed a very large piece of wood. People were yelling, hey, is there a key to the jail? And John was heard to say, this will make a good enough key. And they broke down the door, and they freed Joshua, who is now named Joshua Glover, by the way. He has a last name. They freed him from that jail. ran him out of town on a cart, and got him to the first stop on the Underground Railroad. It's pretty amazing. For the next 3 weeks, he went about 25 miles in distance, but he traveled about 100 miles to do it. He went from house to house to house. About 7 different places they stopped him, different stops of people on the Underground Railroad who were willing to put him up for a short amount of time, feed him, and then move him to the next stop. All of these people risked federal imprisonment and federal fines for aiding a fugitive. Sherman Booth risked federal imprisonment and federal fines for aiding a fugitive. Eventually, they got him on a steamer, and ultimately he ended up in Canada and spent the rest of his life a free man. And you can actually go and you can find, there's records of where he lived outside of Toronto, and he had a little farm, and he sold farm stuff and got married and lived out his life as a free person. But I think the significant part of this, it's an amazing story, and I've actually left a lot of it out for the sake of time. It's an amazing story of a man's drive to be free. But he would have never made it to Canada if people like Sherman Booth and John Raycraft and all these people who housed him on the Underground Railroad and all these people who risked their own freedom and their own property, if they had not taken a stand and stepped up for him, he would have ended up back in chains in Missouri without a question. And that's why I think this is a very important story for us, because this world, this country needs people that are willing to stand up for liberty and for freedom, even in the face of persecution or jail or whatever it might be. I was talking to a friend of mine, a very prominent activist in the state of Missouri. He spends countless hours working and laboring at the state legislature. He was actually at the state capitol every single day that their state legislature was in session this last year, and he has his own business, so this is a huge sacrifice. And I said to him, I said, Ron, why in the world do you dedicate yourself so much to this cause? And he said, well, Mike, he said, I'm a Christian. And he said, I take my direction from the 19th verse and the 18th chapter of Genesis. Do you know that one? And of course, who knows Genesis 18:19 or whatever, 18:19, that's not exactly a prominent verse. But I went and I looked it up, and it says this. God is actually talking about Abraham, and it says, for I have chosen him so that he will direct his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just. And he said, Mike, that right there defines the way of the Lord, doing what is right and just. And then he started to talk to me about his view of justice. And he said, justice is about taking care of the poor, helping the powerless, helping those that are disenfranchised and disaffected. And he said this to me. He said, Mike, if you want to see people that are poor, powerless, and disaffected, just let government get out of control. I said, wow, that's pretty significant. And it really clicked with me. That's why he does what he does. He believes that it's an act of righteousness, it's an act of justice to pursue liberty. So that's really the message that I want to bring today. I told you I'm not a theologian, I'm a political activist. But I believe very passionately that our faith needs to inform our political views, and our faith needs to lead us to action. I was looking at James, and I believe Norman mentioned some of these verses earlier. In James chapter 2:17, James said, even so faith, if it has no works, is dead, being by itself. God calls us to action. And that's my call to you guys today. Involve yourself in the process. Find ways to advance liberty. I want to close with one final quote from a man that I knew very much about being enslaved and dealing with tyranny. It's Frederick Douglas. And he said this. He said, find out just what people will submit to, and you have found out the exact amount of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them. And these will continue until they are resisted with either words or blows or both. The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress. I got to the point in my life that I was tired of giving in. I was tired of submitting. And that's why I got involved with the 10th Amendment Center. That's why I'm here in front of you today as a Christian, as a man who wants to live free, working with everything I have to advance that freedom. And I hope that, and I know that you will join me in that fight.